It's time to get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third installment of the Plant Manager series. And for this session, we're going to focus on element 8.1 of the new standard, environmental controls and planning. And the goal here really is to kind of go through the requirements, talk about some examples. Those of you that are just updating your programs, hopefully this will give you some ideas on what changes will be required. For those of you that are getting ready for your recertification audit to the new standard, we'll try to give you some pointers on the registration auditor and what they may be looking for as far as evidence to validate conformity to the newer requirements. So that's kind of what my goal is. Again, just want to thank the DEQ for inviting a number of you folks. Probably about somewhere around 30% of you guys are already clients or have been clients recently, and we obviously appreciate working with and supporting your ISO programs. Another third of you are people that have been getting emails and newsletters, and you're right on the verge of writing me a purchase order to do some work, and I appreciate that. And then a third of you guys are new people that I haven't had a chance to interact with before. Briefly, just as a brief introduction, I've been in the environmental field about 30 years now. Did some early work in the construction business. Got involved with the underground storage tank heyday, pulled out a bunch of tanks and took some soil samples, sampled a bunch of wells. Got involved with the ISO business in about 1999 when I was working with a company that helped Chrysler certify their facilities, and kind of been working in the ISO field on and off ever since then. About 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, I started my own practice, and then 10 years ago, started doing some contract auditing work with a registration company. And so I hope to bring the common sense solution to the requirements, and from the registration side as far as what I think your registration auditors might be looking for. Again, just to summarize some of the key changes in the previous webinar, we've talked about scope and context, and we've talked about EMS leadership and integration. In this particular session, we're going to talk about environmental controls for our activities, outsourced services, and supply chain. And the next installation will cover performance monitoring, management review, and the continual improvement requirements. So again, because of the size of the group, we will not be able to open up the verbal question chain. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to chime in via the chat box. Again, for those of you that have had a chance to look at the standard, this version again is based on the Plan, Do, Check, Act. Today specifically, we're going to be looking at the Do portion, the section 8 called Operations, and specifically section 8.1, Operational Planning and Control. Just as a reminder, the standard is now set up based on this new Annex SL format, the ISO 9001-2015 standard, 14,001-2015, and hopefully to be issued 45,001-2017 for health and safety. These management system standards are all going to be set up on the same 10 sections. They'll be using some of the same language. And the ultimate goal here is to make these standards easy to integrate into a single management system for the organization. And we've seen a lot of companies taking the opportunity when they have to upgrade to the new standard to actually integrate their quality and environmental programs. And I think making them more effective and getting management better engaged. So today we're going to focus primarily on Section 8.1, Operational Planning and Control. The previous standard called this Operational Controls, Section 446. And the newer standard talks a little bit more generally about things they want us to control. If you recall, in the previous standard, it said we would control our significant aspects. And that has been dramatically expanded to include other issues, and we'll talk about those. But the goal here is to be able to control the organization's impact on the environment. I just added this slide today because I was looking at the ISO site. There's two elements that sound relatively similar. 614 talks about planned actions. 8.1 talks about operational control and planning. And if you do get a chance to look at 614, it talks about planning actions for our significant aspects, compliance obligations, and risk and opportunities, which is referenced in 8.1. So is it an operational control or planned action? I don't know, but they sound very similar to me. So like I said, if you get a chance, look at 614. I think there are some subtle differences, but the 8.1 talks about the implementation of those planned actions. So here's the first part of the standard operational control and planning. Basically says the organization shall control and maintain processes. That's the new word, not procedures, but processes, to implement the actions in 6.1 and 6.2. Basically refers to our risk and opportunities, aspects, and our objectives. We're going to establish the operating criteria or requirements. We're going to implement the controls process. And now they're challenging organizations to use the same hierarchy of control that they've been talking about in your safety program for years. So is it, the best thing to do is to eliminate the impact. And then the lowest part of the hierarchy is going to be some type of a operational control procedure. So what needs to be controlled? Again, we've gotten away from the 446 definition of operational control that focused on significant aspects. As you can see in the requirement there, it referenced 6.1, which deals with risk, and 6.2, which dealt with our objectives. So we need to control our significant aspects, our compliance obligations, which is 6.1.3, our objectives, which are talked about under 6.1.2, and our risk and opportunities, which are talked about in 6.1.1. So again, it's not just significant aspects that the auditor can now expect to see controlled. Because before, as a registration auditor, they told me that if it's not a significant aspect, I can't write a finding under operational control. And if it was a legal issue, you had to go back to 432. And there were a number of issues that it became difficult to write findings against. So the new definitions here have really expanded the areas that will be audited relative to your control processes. Outsourced services and your level of control and influence of those will vary, and we'll talk a lot about that in the setting. Control our planned changes, management of change, and then look at our activities from a life cycle perspective: design, procurement, outsourced processes, contractors, transportation, and delivery of our products. So these are some of the things that we should see controlled now as part of your environmental program. A number of these things, the the controls, it was alluded to that they should be controlled, but now the requirements are much more specific. And when you have a more specific requirement, you have more opportunities for more specific nonconformity. And that's what we're all trying to avoid. It talks about, and this is out of the appendix, so when you guys get ready to implement this section, do not ignore the appendix 8.1. In the appendix, it talks about different types of controls. So basically, A talks about process design and monitoring. And B is going to be your physical controls, your emission controls, your wastewater treatment system, your oil water separators, your containment systems, high-level alarms. Those would be a technology type control. Using competent personnel to ensure desired results. So this may be a control where you specify only these people can do this activity, and then you define specific training for those people in that position. A good example for that might be people that are allowed to sign manifests. We're not going to let anybody sign a manifest. It's these 3 people. They're going to have the proper DOT and RCRA training, and that's a type of a control for that compliance obligation. Again, process design. How is the process going to be completed? Monitoring or measuring process. So different types of inspections. So maybe a safety inspection checks on emergency response. We have another environmental check on the universal waste that every auditor wants to focus on, because our maintenance guys can't seem to get the 4-foot bulb in the 4-foot box and the 8-foot bulb in the 8-foot box labeled and dated. So we implement an inspection as part of a control of that requirement. And then the last thing it talks about here is documented procedures and work instructions. Those have always been types of controls that we've thought about. This is definitely a way to document what our process should be, but all controls do not need to be documented. The challenge is if you don't document it, how do you take credit for it? How do you demonstrate to your registration company that they're implemented and effective? Well, the first place you might do it is you might link it somewhere on your aspects list. Talk about, is training the control? Is there an inspection? Are certain people allowed to do an activity? I mean, that's documented, but it doesn't have to be a formal procedure or work instruction. Again, just a real brief discussion on the hierarchy of controls. The ISO people are trying to get people to consider, can we eliminate the impact of the environment? Such as, here are the examples: banning PCBs, CFCs, any other chemical we can actually eliminate from our process. Can we substitute? Can we go from a solvent-based parts washer to a water-based solvent in our parts washer? Can we implement engineering controls? Oxidizers for air emissions, scrubbers, containment for our oil storage and chemical storage. And then last but not least, administrative controls, instructions, visual labeling of our recycling areas, SDS sheets, etc. So again, we're going to want to demonstrate to our external auditor that we've at least considered this hierarchy of controls. And at this point, maybe you're only going to talk about it. You don't have to have a formalized, checklist of considerations. But it would sure be nice if in your management review minutes or in your meeting with the environmental team to review your aspects list and finalize your controls, if you could document some notes relative to potential elimination or other methodologies of control. So at this point, there's no documentation requirement for this, but to kind of speak to the standard and show the auditor that you're kind of moving in this direction, some discussion and notes along this line would be helpful. Any questions so far? Don't let me down. I'm counting on you guys. Okay. Well, if they come up, please do ask. Management of change. There is not a specific element for management of change, and I again, in looking for the research for this presentation, there was some discussion within the ISO people. Should we have a separate element for management change? And they decided they would put management of change in the elements where it belongs. So in 6.1.2, I'm trying to get these memorized, it talks about changes in aspects. Well, in 8.1, it says the organization shall control plan changes and review the consequences of unintended changes, taking action to mitigate any adverse effects as necessary. Now, I've had a couple of lively discussions on what an unintended change is, and I guess I'm open to any debate or comments on what that could be. Now, obviously, a control change is something where we make a change, we plan it, we think about it, we control it. Unintended changes, I guess it would be a change or absence that planning process. But at the end of the day, being able to mitigate any adverse effects as necessary. So with the organizations that I'm working with to help upgrade their programs, we're really trying to take credit for the existing management of change processes at the facility. And where necessary, trying to add either a checkbox or a space to put notes for environmental information. So take a look at your capital expenditure review and approval forms and process. There may be some opportunities there to at least demonstrate some consideration of environmental issues. Through your new part approval or PPAP process, there should be some review of the customer requirements for the new part. Hopefully, some discussion of the environmental portions of that would be helpful. Many organizations have an engineering change or an engineering review process for projects and engineering changes. Again, hopefully, we should see some evidence there that you've looked at environmental changes. Again, the big thing that we're looking for is, has it or will it impact our significant aspects? Will it impact our performance goals and objectives? And will it require any new compliance obligations? Those are the three big things we're trying to understand as we go through a management of change. So if you keep those things in mind, if you can populate some notes and some check boxes and things to show an environmental consideration, that'll go a long ways. CapEx is the capital expenditure. So most companies, if they implement a capital project, the first step is to get the funding authorized or approved, and so the capital expenditure process is how the companies do that. Many organizations already have a new chemical approval process. At a minimum, they've got somebody that's going to review the SDS sheet coming in. Some organizations have a very formalized form where that's documented. That's a great management of change process. And then typically during your normal operational reviews and management reviews, there will be an open discussion of changes. So a new line's coming in, new products coming in. We're bringing in a new process. It'd be nice in those meetings, which historically have been focused on financial and quality issues, to start populating some of those operational review meetings with some notes on environmental changes or lack of changes, just some evidence that you considered your environmental program during the review of the change. So there is, again, no requirement to have a formalized environmental management of change process, but you do need to be able to demonstrate how changes are reviewed and how environmental considerations are considered during the change process. And you can either make your life easy and add a few boxes and places, or you can just try to talk to the change management process, because you will see in the shaded box there, there's nothing that says this must be documented unless you need it to demonstrate that you're actually getting it completed. So any questions on management of change? But most of sites already have fairly well implemented MOC processes. It'll just be a challenge to get people to start taking some notes and pieces of information on the environmental parts of that change. Outsourced processes. Again, this is I'll call it new requirement of the standard. I sent parts out to be painted. Before, that was out of scope. We didn't think about what happened past our fence line. The ISO people are now asking us to consider how we might be able to control or influence things that are occurring within or outside of our fence line. So the standard says the organization shall ensure that outsourced processes are controlled or influenced. That pretty specific. We're going to control or influence these outsourced processes. Then it says the type and the extent of control or influence to be applied to the process shall be defined within the environmental management system. So those are the words from the standard. Those are the words that you're going to have to demonstrate conformity to. Your auditor will say, what type of control or influence do you exert on your outsourced processes? And you will show them or tell them something. That'll be up to you. But a couple of points of edification here. The word outsourced process sounds like it occurs someplace else. But actually, an outsourced process can actually occur on your site. So it's not necessary an off-site activity. So these processes can occur on or off-site. Our control or influence may include subcontracted processes or services and products. And again, here's another quote from the appendix. It says, when a process is outsourced or when products and services are supplied by an external provider, the organization's ability to exert control or influence can vary from direct control to limited or no influence. So there may be outsourced services that we have no control or influence. Let's say our friends at BMW tell us, you shall use Joe's plating to plate our parts. That really limits our degree of control over that, at least the selection of that supplier. Now, there may be other things that we can do to control or influence that process, and we'll talk about that. It says, is waste disposal considered an outsourced process? Great question, Ruth. And Amanda is chiming in with what they've done. That's great. We consider it an outsourced when we did our update and our auditors were happy with that. We had done some audits on our waste sites. We got into trouble because we were doing audits, but we didn't have anything specifically stating what what they would do. Okay. Well, Amanda, I think you were off to a good start there, just in the identification of it. It's going to be the interpretation of what that means, because what's the control? What's the influence? So in a second here, we're going to talk about the linkage between the outsourced process, what we're trying to accomplish, and then what the actual control is. And I think if you've got that defined clearly in your own mind, it'll be very easy for you guys to discuss that with your external auditor. Okay, and yes, my hat's off to Holly, Ruth, Amanda, and Lene. Thank you for your questions and answers. They are appreciated. So hopefully this will start to answer some of our questions, because in the standard, it doesn't define an outsourced process, it just defines outsourced. So if you go to 334, the definition of outsourced is it's a process that is within the scope of your management system. It is integral. Yes, I'm not hooked on phonics. To your organization's functioning. It is needed for the management system to achieve its intended outcomes. Now, that's an interesting statement there. The liability for conforming to the requirements is retained by the organization. And the organization and the external provider have a relationship where the process is perceived by interested parties as being carried out by the organization. So that particular interested party is probably your customer. You know, they perceive that the painting and the waste disposal and the janitorial services are all part of your organization. So there is a perception that that is part of what they're purchasing. So when you try to start to whittle down what's an outsourced process or service or not, hopefully this definition will help. It's not critical that you and your auditor agree, because let's go back to the previous slide. The organization shall ensure that outsourced processes are controlled or influenced. That means the organization shall identify what processes are outsourced. It doesn't give that responsibility to your registration company. So your auditor might say, well, how do you control or influence Office Depot? Because they provide paper to your facility. And you can just say, well, we did not consider that to be an outsourced process. So here's where, again, I would challenge you guys to push back a little bit on your registration auditor, because the words in the standard don't give them the authority to decide what's outsourced and not. So if they ask the question, what processes do you consider to be outsourced? And you tell them, you conform to the words. There is no nonconformity to be had. So that's the point where they can make a suggestion. You can tell them how wonderful their ideas are. You can butter them up like a piece of toast, because that's what we do with our auditors. I've had a lot of butter put on me in the past. And they might suggest it as an OFI if they choose to put it into writing, but don't accept it as a nonconformity, because the words do have meanings. So here's some examples. Now, again, let's go back to here. What are the intended outcomes of the organization? Well, from our previous webinars, we've talked about the minimum and intended outcomes of our environmental program are our ability to enhance environmental performance, meet our compliance obligation, and achieve our environmental objectives. So that's a kind of a broad spectrum of intended outcomes that these outsourced processes could influence. So let's talk a little bit about different types of outsourced services. Now, when I read the standard, I can, if I want to get confused, I can. What's an outsourced process versus an outsourced service versus a product or supplier? But don't get confused, because the standard now requires that all of those be controlled or influenced to the extent that we can. So don't get too wrapped up on, is this an outsourced process, an outsourced service? Is this a contractor? Is this a supplier? Just, they're outsourced. We have to decide how they can impact our ability to achieve our intended outcome, and then implement a type of a control or influence to mitigate that. So the first example here, our contractor. This is the first person here we would call a contractor. He comes in, he does forklift maintenance on our forklifts. First question is, how do they impact our intended outcomes? Well, he could create a spill. Acid spill hydraulics could impact my compliance obligation. Then how do I control or influence that? Well, that's an easy one to answer, because we've implemented a contractor training or communication process. So there's the outsourced process. Our customers view that we are maintaining our forklifts, that service is envisioned as being done by us. It impacts our ability to achieve our intended outcome, and here's our level of control. Another company provides steel to us. They send us steel. Well, they could deliver us some off-spec steel that doesn't meet our specification. It could generate excess transportation if we have to return it. Or if we actually process it, it could generate some scrap parts. So how do we control or influence our steel supplier? Well, we may have a specific steel specification. This could be reflected on our purchase order. Our quality program may have an incoming inspection process. So again, there's the outsourced process, the impact to our program, and our degree of control or influence. Okay, we send parts out for painting. They could deliver us some off-spec painted parts that could increase our scrap rates, or result in additional transportation cost, disposal, or recycling. First piece of place to exert control would be a supplier profile. When we choose to do business with that company, what's our due diligence? Do we expect them to have a quality certification? Do we ask about environmental performance or compliance? That may be one area right now that's being managed by quality that we might be able to enhance to demonstrate some environmental review at that point. We could go on site and do an on-site audit or inspection of their operations. We also could do an inspection of the incoming parts to validate that they meet our specification. I just recently had an organization where they were using a painting company who went through an EPA enforcement action. And as part of that EPA enforcement action, got very close to shutting down that organization, which left my customer without anybody to paint their parts. That's a big deal. That's part of this risk and opportunity thing that they're trying to get us to manage. Heat treating. Excess oil in the totes creates a possible leak or spill. We could address that in our contract. specifications or purchase order for that service. A recycling company could find that our recyclables, there's no market for it, and they could have to landfill what we perceive as recycled materials. That could be addressed in our contract with them. The landfill that we send our waste to, obviously, sending it to a landfill creates some liability. They may or may not be in compliance. So our control or influence might be some type of a review of their compliance history. Some organizations periodically visit or audit their waste treatment companies. Those would all be considered types of control or influence. Our waste hauling company could create an offsite spill. So our contract with them could specify that they're responsible for offsite spills, that they will have competent employees providing the service, and that they will have an action plan in place in the event that they spill our materials. On-site janitorial service. Again, improper disposal of cleaning chemicals or improper waste disposal. Again, I was in one organization. I just happened to watch the janitor come in. They picked up the trash can and the recycle can, and they dumped them in the same container. Recycling was not being done. So you could again, your contract with them could specify the requirements. They could go through your contractor management process and training and communications with them. Last example would be the delivery of new oil. So one of the impacts to our intended outcomes could be a spill during product delivery. So our control or influence could be the requirement to the transportation to have a spill kit on their truck and drivers that are trained in spill response, that we have a spill response work instruction, and that our employee is always present during the filling of our tank. Those would be different types of control or influence. So as you can see, some of these are things that we've already been doing as part of our contractor management programs. Some of these are things that we're already doing as part of our contract process. But again, it's up to you guys to determine and define how this is done to your external auditor. So whether you put together a matrix of sorts or have some type of a risk criteria where high risk services are controlled, low risk aren't, some way within your procurement process, it would be nice to have this defined. And this is probably, I would speculate, one of the I'd say more confusing or challenging parts to implement relative to our operational controls. Again, other types of control or influence is when we decide to do business with a company. So, do they have a quality certification? I personally believe that a company with a certified quality program has a better environmental footprint than an organization that doesn't. Even though it's not specifically an environmental program, I think just the fact that they are focused on scrap, material efficiencies, their business, and they're certified, I think that organization would likely have a better environmental footprint. Now, what the ISO people would like is for you to expect all of your suppliers to be ISO 14000 certified. But again, that's not very reasonable at this stage of the game. Many of us deal with smaller suppliers, local companies that just can't afford that type of expense. But again, take a look at them very similar to you do with your quality programs, because most companies say we want you to have an ISO 9000 certification or better. If you don't, here's our quality profile. Fill this out and tell us how you manage your quality program. It wouldn't take much to start asking a few questions about, do they have an environmental certification? Do they recycle? Have they had any compliance histories or major spills? Those types of questions could pretty easily be asked. And then we've got other requirements, restricted chemical lists that our customers give us. Our IMDS requirements, we could ask them to give us their information. If you're selling into Europe, or you reach compliance, the infamous conflict minerals, and then ultimately our contracts and specifications with them define our requirements back to them. So if we go back to the words, the standard, it says our outsourced processes shall be controlled or influenced. The degree of control or influence will be defined within the environmental or just the management system. And if you go back to the appendix 8.1, there's a realization that the degree of control or influence can vary dramatically. The on-site guy that does the forklift maintenance, we can control him very well. He's on our property. The outsourced service that our customer tells us to use, we may have very little ability to control or influence those activities. Okay, any questions on outsourced processes or services? So 6.1 says that we had to identify our aspects from a life cycle perspective, which I trust you all have done. And 8.1 says that consistent with our new life cycle perspective, we shall do these things. Establish controls and requirements for design and development. Determine our environmental requirements for procurement of products and services. Communicate relevant requirements to our external providers, including contractors. And provide information about significant aspects associated with transportation or delivery of our product, the use, end of life, and disposal of our product. So these are more areas where we should see some controls. So design and development, again, you can take a look at your product design. Many of you guys are involved in the automotive sector, and when you design automotive parts, ultimately that part will go into an automobile. The weight of the automobile significantly impacts the fuel efficiency of the automobile, and the weight of your product contributes to the weight of the vehicle. So product weight is a environmental product. The durability or life expectancy of our product, again, when our product fails in the vehicle has to go in for repair. These repair operations create environmental impacts. So if we can take a product that's rated to last 10 years or 200,000 miles and make it'll last 15 years or 200 or 300,000 miles, that would require that vehicle to have less service and impact of the vehicle during the use of the product. So the durability of our product becomes an aspect of our product. Many of you will say, well, we're not design responsible. Well, if that's the case, then you are unable to control or influence your design process. But take a look at that, because sometimes the customer may give you a design and then ask you to improve or lower the cost of manufacturing of that part, and you may have some ability to get some feedback. Take a look at your process design. When you design new assembly cells and new process lines, do you look at tool design, new equipment purchases, and fuel or energy efficiency, selection of chemicals relative to toxicity? those could be considered design requirements. And I hope I am giving you some examples of requirements versus a life cycle perspective. And we'll go through each phase here pretty quickly. But the box tells us integrate this with our quality program. There's no need to have a separate procedure that talks about design or engineering. Just take a look at your quality process, try to add the word environmental a few times, speak to what the requirements are, which may be few or non-existent, and then be able to speak to them as part of your registration audits. Specific requirements could be customer-specific specifications or drawings, the weight and durability of your product, the construction materials of your product, potential recyclability, and then the packaging specification for your product. All things that do impact or influence the environment. This is just a broad brush overview of what's called a design for the environment process. You don't have to have a fully implemented design for the environment process in place, even though the ISO people would love it if you did. But it just shows how, from the concept of a product all the way through product design, how the environmental issues can be considered. Now, I work for one organization. They've got a headquarters campus. They've got 40 facilities, and at the headquarters campus, they've got an R&D operation and design center. So at the facility level, they don't have much influence or control over the design process. At the headquarters function, they do. So this particular organization is being certified. They're certifying their corporate campus as well as the 40 other locations. So during the auditing of the manufacturing sites, there's not much of a discussion on controls for design. But when you get into the headquarters site, that's where they're going to have a lot more discussion with your design engineers. And again, just a few more examples of design considerations. Now, these will be things that during your registration audit, if you could speak to them and say, well, we're not design responsible, but we do have some say over how our products are packaged. We push our customers toward using a returnable dunnage versus cardboard, and that's the extent of our influence over the design process. And if that's the extent of it, then that's the extent of it. When you look at external providers and contractors, and in your procurement process, the first thing we want to do is communicate our EMS requirements to them. That's also required as part of our awareness program if they're on site. So we want to communicate to them our expectations of them, their conduct, our policy, the specific procedures that they have to conform to, and emergency response requirements. We need to try to validate their competencies. So as an example, we may outsource HVAC servicing to a contractor. We're going to verify that their technicians are EPA certified technicians. And then we want to communicate to them their compliance obligations. If they bring a chemical on site, they should have an SDS sheet with them. If they generate waste, they either need to take it with them and make sure that it's being properly disposed of. If they're transporting hazardous chemicals, they're doing it in accordance with the proper DOT shipping requirements. But these would be specific requirements that we need to give to them, either in their contract with us, via a specific work instruction or training process, and then validate that these things are being done properly. Procurement requirements, again, take a look at the people that we decide to do business with. Once we decide to do business with somebody, that's the time when we can really influence the environment by choosing to do work with responsible companies. So many companies are looking at a vendor consolidation because they want fewer shipments transported to their site. So if I can deal with 15 vendors instead of 50, that means that there would be potentially less deliveries of products to my facility, less impacts from the transportation of these materials. A new chemical approval process. How is the toxicity and impact of chemicals reviewed when new chemicals are approved? Do we buy things with a specified recycled content? Packaging requirements. When we specify things are packaged to us, do we ask for our components to come to us in returnable dunnage so we can turn around and return it back to them instead of using cardboard? And then are there specific restricted chemicals that we tell organizations that we don't want to be in our products? And these would all be perceived as specific requirements of procurement. So again, take a look at your packaging, mercury-free initiatives. We don't want any hexavalent chrome in our paints. All of these can be different types of controls or requirements that we have for our purchasing vendors. Now, what's critical here is that when our purchasing department is asked the question, what are the environmental requirements of your purchasing process, that they're able to articulate that to the external auditor. So the first step is for you guys to, come up with a picture of what they are, communicate that to your purchasing people, and make sure that we have some documented evidence that that these things are being adhered to. And then the last element of the life cycle says we're going to provide information about significant aspects relative to the transportation of our product, the use of our product, and the end of life of our product. Now, most of us are not manufacturing trimethyl death. We're probably actually producing things that are fairly inert. And this particular requirement may not fully apply to us. But let's just imagine that we're BASF, where we manufacturing truckloads of benzene, drums of benzene. We transport this over the road. We give that to customers to use. Well, in the transportation and delivery of our product, there is a significant environmental risk. They're going to validate that it's being shipped properly under DOT rules, emergency response, planning is intact, drivers had the required competencies, etc. In the use of our product, again, the number one thing that we communicate to our customer is what's in our product. And we do that through our IMDS program. So through the IMDS program, you communicate to the customer what it is you're providing them, what the materials are, and the theory is that could be communicated to their customer and improve the ability to recycle your materials. So again, if you were BASF and you were manufacturing a trimethyl DEF, you'd at least give them the SDS sheet for that. Most of you guys will probably just comply with your IMDS requirements. Some organizations have very intense product take-back programs where they control the disposal of their product by taking it back. So, HP takes back toner cartridges, Batteries Plus takes back some batteries. I've got a number of customers that take back plastic components that they manufacture and then they rechip it and reuse the product. So yeah, is the IMDS system sufficient to track the restricted chemicals? I would say yes. If you're complying with that, I think that's great evidence to demonstrate conformance to your auditor. So in a nutshell, some of the biggest, some of the action items for you guys that are upgrading to the new standard, verify controls for significant aspects and legal requirements. So it's no longer just operational controls for significant aspects. It includes compliance obligations, risk and opportunities, and objectives. So ask yourself the question, how are those controlled? Define your management of change processes. Where do we review environmental requirements? And if we don't include the environmental review, not currently, change that so we do. So take a look at your capital expenditure form. Can you add environmental review as part of the checklist? Check that, and then also populate some notes as part of your management review meetings that environmental changes were considered. Look at our ability to control and influence our outsourced services. So the first step is for you guys to articulate to yourselves what these controls or requirements are. So think of the outsourced service, how it influences our intended outcome, and then what our control mechanism is. Make sure people in engineering, procurement, and quality are aware of these requirements so that when they're audited, the management team will now be audited. They can speak to how these changes are reviewed and how environmental considerations might be addressed. And then look at your design process if you have design responsibility for either a product design or your process design, and ask the question, what are the environmental requirements as part of that design process? Is there any questions on any of the requirements that we've covered so far? Okay, so I appreciate you guys dialing in and listening this late in the day. I know it's time for most of us to go home. We do have an upcoming ISO 14001 transition webinar, which is a paid webinar. It's about, what is it? It's about 5.5 hours. Covers the complete transition process. We also have an abbreviated webinar on just looking at life cycle perspective, risk and opportunities. That's about 2.5 hours. We've got some auditor training coming up. So again, if you need to enhance your auditor pool, please think of us there. We do have the last installment of the Plant Manager series. And maybe you can get your managers to show up for this one. We're going to cover management review, continual improvement. And the one thing that I didn't reference here, but I don't know how to not cover it, it's going to be performance monitoring. The requirements are 9.1, performance evaluation. So we'll talk about performance evaluation, continual improvement, and then how that links into the management review process, which I think will be an excellent chance to get your plant manager, hopefully, maybe some of your quality managers to sit in on that one. Lastly, this is kind of who we are. I think I've told a lot of you who we are. But if you guys need any help, we do internal audits. We can do snapshot audits, come in for one day, look at the hot spots, give you some ideas there. Compliance evaluations, if you need to look at your legal and other stuff, your stormwater plans, your SPCCs. You know where we live now. Don't forget about us. And that's how to get a hold of us. So anyways, I do appreciate the questions. They do help keep the ball rolling. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to call or email. Really, my goal here is just to make this as seamless and as streamlined as possible. If we can get organizations to better integrate these requirements into the the procurement, the quality, and engineering processes, this stuff can be done very, very easily. It doesn't have to require a lot of extra effort. And then for those of you that were probably texting me or emailing me about not being able to log in, I will, for those of you that want to relive this experience, who can blame you, right? I will post the recorded version of this on our YouTube site and send the link out to you guys so you can look at maybe getting your plant managers and operations managers and quality managers to sit through some of this stuff. So that's it. Appreciate you, all the thank yous. Again, any questions, comments, emails, I love them. Emails are free. Don't let the word get out. But and then if you need any ultimate support, we